further ado, I'm pleased to introduce to you Commander Tomas Bonome. He serves as the Director of Federal Occupational Health, or as you know it, FOH, a component of the Program Support Center, or PSC, within the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. In this position, he oversees clinical health, behavioral health, environmental health and safety, and wellness and health promotion services. Commander Tomas Bonome.
I want to share a little bit about FOH and as well as some of the priorities we're working on. Next slide. I'm advancing. There we go. So this is basically how we're structured. Of course, with the new administration, we've had some changes in some of the names up here. Dr. Price is currently the Secretary of Health and Human Services, recent confirmation of the Senate. John Bardis is our Assistant Secretary for Administration, so also a political appointee that handles all administrative pieces for the department. Then there's my boss, Alan Sample, who's the Director of the Program Support Center, and some of the sister portfolios that offer other shared services in addition to FOH. Myself, and then we have a number of service directors here for our other programs, including our Wellness Health Promotion Services, so if you're familiar with those, that's John King. Environmental Health and Safety Services, Commander Robert Gibbs. Our Clinical Health Services Group, Julia Shiner is the Acting Director, newly appointed in that role. And of course, we have here Bradley Christ, who is the Director for Behavioral Health Services. So that's a little bit about what the change has been. I can tell you, here in the department, the feeling change is certainly in the case of John Bardis, much more of a business focus. So he came from the medical world doing supply chain management. A quick overview for those who may be new here to the table and new to FOH. So we were created back in 1946 through an amendment to the Public Health Service Act, and that really gave authority to the Secretary, and that was delegated down to be a consultant around the development of occupational health programs within the federal government. And over time that has grown in what we do, including behavioral health services. We've been around for nearly 70 years, and why I like being here is we're fully reimbursable, operating free of congressional appropriations. If we're not doing a good job, the folks in here, all of you, vote by walking away. Now I'm going to hand it over to Mr. Bradley Christ, our Director of Behavioral Health Services. Thank you, everyone.
It is my pleasure to introduce Bradley Christ, who serves as the Director of Behavioral Health Services of Federal Occupational Health, a component of the Program Support Center, or PSC, within HHS. In this capacity, Brad is responsible for managing and providing the PSC team with the resources necessary to support customer agencies with a variety of occupational health products. Services include the Employee Assistance Program, or EAP, organizational development and leadership, which includes organizational development, leadership coaching, individual and team coaching, executive development, career coaching, and more. Another service is psychological testing and evaluation program, and finally our work-life programs. Mr. Bradley Christ.
All right, Linda, thank you for that introduction. Most of you in here know a lot already about our Employee Assistance Program. You know a lot about our work-life services because many of you are coordinating and receiving those services yourself.
To introduce you to someone who is really passionate about work-life and EAP. Dr. Tamburo has worked in the EAP field in various capacities for more than 27 years. And is currently serving as the Acting Director for the Work Life and EAP with Federal Occupational Health. In this role, she manages the operations and services of a national contract product line in the Behavioral Health Division of Federal Occupational Health. She provides program oversight and direction for services provided to over 1 million federal employees. Dr. Melissa Tamburo.
And the idea for this meeting grew from our national meeting where once every, that meeting we actually had our speaker today, Mr. Robert Inveld, speak to the clinicians about the state of the art for critical incident response. We wanted to be able to provide you with the insight and the knowledge base from where FOH comes from for how and why we deliver the critical incident response services that we do. So without further ado, what I'd like to do is introduce our speaker, Mr. Robert Invelt. I'm excited to be able to have him share with you the best practices and information and bring you along to understand how FOH is moving from an older model of critical incident response and moving towards a model of resiliency. Resilience really is at the root of what we're doing in EAP, in work life, at FOH, and across our Department of Health and Human Services. So you're going to hear a lot about that today. So I wanted to frame for you the work that we've been doing, and you can see on our slide here the number of responses and grief groups that we've done over the past last full fiscal year and year to date now. We've been kind of busy. In FY16, we had groups respond to 243 crisis responses that served 2,063 attendees. And then you can also see the grief groups, and we'll get into what the distinction is between them in our presentation. And you can see for year to date, we're right on track to be about the same for that number of responses. One thing that carves out FOH as different from other EAP suppliers is how we respond to a critical incident. We've got the National Response Team that consists of about 15 clinicians, master's level clinicians that are specifically certified and trained in doing critical incident response, who have go bags in their offices. So if something happens and we get a call and they need to go, they're ready to go. There's obviously assessment and consultation before that happens, but we have a team of deployable folks based and packed and ready to go. So now, without further ado, I will read Mr. Invelt's bio. Robert Invelt, LCSW, CEAP, is the owner of Robert Douglas and Associates, an EAP consulting and training firm. In the field, Robert has authored the EAP industry's preferred critical incident response approach, multi-systemic resiliency approach. His book has also been released in Japan.
I also I want to thank FOH for certainly inviting me, and more importantly, sharing the vision on the importance of operationalizing resilience. We talk about resilience as this term that's out there. We certainly know about adversities. We all go through adversities and people bounce back from that, and we see that as resilience. But how that happens is really what's key here. There are things that we can be doing that foster resilience. There are things that we can be doing to make sure we don't get in the way of an organic, resilient process. So we're going to be talking about resilience at a much deeper level, the importance of all of your roles and the organizational role in fostering resilience. I started rolling this program out, this training module, back in 2013. And at that time, it was the EAP field was kind of in between a number of different critical incident response approaches. And a little borrowing from here, a little borrowing from there. There wasn't a real consistent level of response approach. And I was fortunate that I was laid off that year from my position in EAP. And I say I was fortunate because now I had all kinds of time to commit to something that's been a passion of mine for a very long time, and that is to do research in resilience, to start answering the questions for EAPs on what's going to be the best approach for our mission. Okay, there are other approaches out there, as I said. They've got their mission too. It doesn't always work for our mission in the kind of work and the kind of employees that you work with. So I've been out training EAPs around the country on this resiliency approach. And the logical sequence to that is, after working with EAPs and working with the people who go out on site, is to work with organizations. Because what we're going to learn, and what I'm going to talk about today, is that it's not EAPs that have the magic bullet here. It's not the EAPs that are going to come in and make everybody resilient. It's you. The organization has the power to really facilitate long-standing resilience. And so we're going to talk about how do you do that, how can you set up your organization for that, what your role in that can be, and how together as partners with EAP really facilitates that. When the research says the most, the majority of people after an adversity bounce back and have a resilient outcome, the majority, without formal intervention, that says a lot. There's research out there that says that, you know what, people are bouncing back without formal intervention. We need to know how that happens. And we need to, as EAP professionals, as I mentioned, incorporate that into our response so we can build on that. I know that many of you have heard of different models, CISM model, psychological first aid, Red Cross model, FEMA model. They're all out there. One of the things that's important is to recognize that we're not trying to say one's better than the other. Don't do this anymore. What we're trying to say here is we need to evolve. We need to learn what we've been doing and see how we can improve upon it. So I know that many of you have a lot of the skills over the years of doing this kind of work. But what I would ask you to do today as we're going through the information is to change your lens, all right? Rather than looking through a lens of a medical model where there's an incident, we rush out, we try to get to the people who are impacted, we provide some kind of level of care, and we identify the patient. And in a resiliency model, we do that too. But when you change your lens to a resiliency lens, not only do you see that person or those people impacted, but you see all of the other systems that are involved in helping, that are involved in empowering and restoring one's level of safety in the process of beginning to bounce back. And those are the things that we need to capture, and those people are you. Those people are your systems within the organization. So we'll be talking about all of that in depth. There we go. I'd like to start with a poll. As you look at these personal attributes on the screen, how many of you are optimists? Okay, fair amount of people, most of the time, right? How many of you are altruists? Oh, come on. Altruism means liking to help people. Altruist? Okay. All right, how about a moral compass? All right, faith and spirituality? You have this, all right. How about a sense of humor? Okay, we'll see. Role models. Are you a role model in your life, or do you have role models? Yes? Okay. How about social supports? Do you have significant others? Yes. And do you have a mission in life, whether a personal mission, a professional mission? Okay. These attributes come from a study where 750 Vietnam vets who were prisoners of war for 6 to 8 years and did not develop PTSD. And when asked how they got through their ordeal, these were the attributes they identified. Now, we often talk about a critical incident as a powerful event, an event that can overwhelm our traditional coping skills. The first thing we need to understand is that these attributes are pretty powerful too. And we all got them. We've all got attributes. We've been using these attributes throughout our lives, dealing with the adversities we've had in our lives. And not only do you have them, your employees have them, EAP responders have them. These are the attributes that we have to help people get connected to, because you know what happens after a critical incident? Sometimes we're stunned, we're disoriented. You know what, after an incident, we may be optimists in general, but right after that incident, you're not feeling very optimistic. Doesn't mean you can't get there. And that's what we want to start doing. That's part of what our crisis intervention is about, helping people reconnect to these strengths that have been working throughout their lives. That's what our crisis intervention is beginning to do. These are some of the other attributes that when people are polled about how they get through adversity, these are the kinds of things that keep coming up. And as you look at those, I'm sure you have some of these too. One of the things that you can do is have a discussion with your teams about how they've gotten through adversity in their lives, either at the workplace or in general, so that they're aware of what their strengths are. You know, we don't often think about what our strengths are. Unless you're going to therapy, then we ask you. But we should have people, it's a good dialogue to have, getting people to recognize what their strengths are, because when it matters, when the incident is upon us, we want to get to them. Now, organizations have attributes too. The great thing about partnering with an EAP is that EAPs are trained, the mission of EAP is to work both with organizations and individuals. Perfect partnership. Now, when you look at the attributes here, and I'll read through them. Proactive employees, well-defined mission, goals, values, fosters opportunities to influence change, clear and open communication, non-judgmental, emphasizes learning, rewards high performance, recognition, supportive colleagues, clear responsibilities, ethical environment, sense of control, job security, supportive management, connectedness amongst the partner. When you go through that list, what comes to your mind? Anybody? I know what comes to my mind. It's I want to work in a place like this, right? And when you think about it, when you have an organization that dedicates its mission to creating this kind of environment, you generally have people who like being there. You create a synergy between the organization and the workers and the employee, right? Now, we typically have created these kinds of environments, or work to create these kinds of environments, because, you know, we get the best performance out of people. And we retain people when we have a real positive environment. But I also want you to think about it this way too. This fosters resilience. When you work in an agency like this and you're committed and connected to your organization, you feed it off each other. You're there for each other in the aftermath of an adversity. That's very powerful. And this is something, when you think about your organizations, how are you coming up? Is there work to be done? Are there things you can do? There probably are. I mean, companies spend millions and millions of dollars to create this. If in your organization you do employee surveys, how many companies do employee surveys, right? This is the stuff you're measuring, right? If employees are identifying with these things, there's a tool for you right then and there where data is available to you to see where your organization is landing. And if it's not landing here, you got some work to do. It'll increase resilience, it'll increase productivity, it'll increase retention. Our objectives for today, we're going to talk about critical incidents, right? I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. The stress response, bereavements, these are the kinds of incidents that we tend to go out on. I want you to understand how resilience is optimized, right? The importance of arriving at safety in the aftermath of an incident, the importance of reconnecting to significant others, and the attributes we just spoke about. We're going to break down how to have a resilient outcome, called the temporal dimensions of resilience. Again, and we talked about the different kinds of attributes. In addition, we want to talk about the approach that your EAP, that FOH is using, right? We want you to understand where they're coming from. That's the kind of partnership. When you call, know what you're calling into and why they may be asking the kinds of questions or asking for certain people to be part of that call. You know, that's really important. So we'll talk about the approaches that they're using, ways to build on that partnership, and most importantly, we're going to talk about the role of, leadership. All right, so what is a critical incident? Any event that has the power to overwhelm our usually effective coping mechanisms. We deal with adversity all the time. Sometimes it's difficult and you know, painful. Sometimes it's very overwhelming. This has been a definition that has been around for a while. I think it still holds up. But I would also add that and/or interrupts regular operational procedures in our organization. So it's not just people being impacted, but the organization is impacted too. It's not, the resources are less available during that time. So there's a dual dynamic here. You may have heard or you may hear the term destructive event as another term that's being out there to either replace or define a critical incident in a different way. A destructive event has been defined as any incident that disrupts an employee's ability to work. I don't know if that's a great definition, or we need to change the definition or update this terminology, but you may hear it. Essentially, we're talking about the same thing. All right. There are different types of stress responses. When people go through a critical incident, there is a physiological reaction. Right. We're going to talk about these two. Right. The neural axis response. That's the one that you experience in traffic. Okay. That's an adversity. Stuck in traffic. Now you're not going to be able to get there. Now you're going to be late. Now you're thinking about what's going to happen when you get there. Are you going to be berated? It's threatening in a sense. And we start hitting the wheel, we start yelling, and all of that sort of thing. That is our bodies having a stress reaction, a level of stimulation, all right? The neuroendocrine axis is the fight or flight, okay? That's a much more intensive. So not only are you having a neural axis response, but you're having a hormonal release too that really packs the punch. The endocrine axis is a long-term stress, okay, that starts tapping into other kinds of physiological components, and I'm not going to get into that one. All right, so again, you have an adverse incident. When there's an incident, our senses are wide open, picking up information. We smell things, we touch things, we hear things. All of that is coming into us and traveling along our neural pathways, right? And it's going to leave us with an interpretation. If we interpret that as a sense of threat, okay, then we have a stimulation. Our bodies release adrenaline. And adrenaline travels through and it stimulates various organs. If our interpretation is not a threat, then we have a release of acetylcholine, which is a relaxing. And that travels through our bodies and it calms us down, right? The key is the interpretation. Not everybody has the same interpretation after an incident. This is critical. You know, we can be very biased if we just assume because there's been a shooting, everybody's impacted. I would be impacted. But that's not true. Not everybody interprets it the same way. Not everybody takes that information in the same way. That's important information, because if I'm going out to help these folks, I need to know how people have interpreted this. That's going to affect my work with them. Certainly if they've really been dramatically impacted. Right? But we can't just, first thing, we just can't assume that everybody's had the same reaction. So the interpretation is different for everybody. Right? When that threat becomes life-threatening and we experience a fear of our death, or the death of a significant other, that triggers in the second stress reaction. That's the fight or flight. That's the one we're looking out for. That's the one where folks get afterwards are in shock, okay, in a state of denial, they're disoriented, right? And we want to really help these folks get to safety, get support around them. The fight or flight has a second release of adrenaline that packs the punch. And as I mentioned, after an incident, folks are going to go through a predictable recovery process. Okay? They're going to experience a level of shock and disbelief. Okay? And this is normal. This is what we would expect. They may have issues related to denial. They can't believe what's just happened. They're not ready to talk about it. They may go into a cycle of avoidance. That's normal too. We need to respect that. We need to nurture that. People will get through that if they're feeling protected and feeling safe. That will fade. We don't want to go up to somebody and, snap out of it. That's not what we're doing. We need to help people feel safe. And then eventually when those things start to fade, folks will start feeling the full impact of the disruption. Memories of the incident start returning. We start having lots of behaviors that are because of the stress response we just went through. People are feeling really fatigued, maybe they're having trouble sleeping. These are all very normal kinds of reactions. This is really the great place where EAPs can really come in and be helpful, to help that normalization process when people are going through all of these different kinds of reactions and they don't know why. And then the last stage is to help people integrate the experience. And that's typically not done in a short-term crisis intervention approach. We're laying the foundation for that. But that's something that's going to evolve as people start to recover, right? We also deal with workplace death, right? We experience a colleague that may die outside of work. The workplace is notified. People are upset. We call the EAP. EAP comes out and helps folks with their reactions. We may deal with a sudden death. This could be something that happens in the field, where you're out there working and something happens and an employee dies while they're at work. Okay, it's unpredicted, it happens, and something that's more traumatic. And I'll get into that in a minute. But the most common kind of death that most EAPs deal with is that employee that dies outside of work, where colleagues are impacted. And if you think about it, the response to this is a resilience approach. Okay, the death of a colleague is an adversity, right? How can we help employees bounce back from that? All right, that's a resilience process. Our goal here isn't to help employees mourn through this. That's a treatment goal. Okay, but in crisis intervention, we want to help people acknowledge the impact and start a process that helps them move forward. So folks are going to have a shock and disbelief when they hear news. They are going to have a level of sadness at some point. Most people, right? And then guess what? Work moves on, right? We got to get back to work. Work doesn't stop. And so our EAPs that come out understand this. What we also understand is that everybody has a different level of connection to the deceased. Not everybody was best buds. Most people may have just had a superficial relationship, a professional relationship. Maybe the relationship of indifference. Maybe they didn't like them. So we just can't assume that because there's a death, everybody's in a state of grieving. Many are not. They're impacted, and we want to respond to that. And that's part of what EAPs, this is the kind of information we need when we're partnering with you about the nature of the loss and how folks are impacted through this. As I mentioned, sudden death is something that often happens as part of work. And it's sudden, it's unexpected. Not only does it carry the loss, the grief reaction, but you have a stress reaction too. All right, so we're dealing with the stress reactions I just talked about, and also the issues related to grief. And then you can add any of these to a traumatic death. Maybe the connection to the person is really deep. Maybe how they died was really graphic, and people witnessed that. Maybe people were present when the person died. There's an awful difficult time when children are killed as a result of an incident that really has an impact. And folks who have gone through this are getting a little closer to the diagnostic criteria of PTSD, or can be. All right, so there are different kinds of death. that EAPs need to understand so that we're in the best position to partner with you and get the services that you need. Again, the key here, though, is we're talking about different depths. What's really most important is everybody has a different level of connection. And based on that connection, you are going to have a different level of impact. Okay, so let's talk about resilience. I won't go through this entire definition, but it means bouncing back. That's the best definition that we're talking about. And when you look at the research, the primary factor of a resilient outcome is having caring and supportive relationships within and outside. So when you look at this picture, that's a wonderful picture. I want employees to get there because that is going to help calm them down, help them feel safe, and that's just facilitating a connection with a significant other. That is so powerful after an incident. Much more powerful than any group I could run. I just don't have the power of a significant other. So we want to look at what the research is saying. We want to be able to include significant others in our process because that really does help folks start to bounce back. Now, it also talks about supportive relationships outside the family. So guess what? That's work for most people. Okay, and it could be, other community relationships and other things you're involved with. But for many people, it's collegial relationships. It's the relationships you have at work, people who have been supportive. It's relationships with managers, supervisors, HR professionals. If you're really culling those relationships, if you have colleagues who are supportive and there for one another, that too is more powerful than what we can provide. So there's really a lot of opportunity within the workplace to create safety and help people start to bounce back right within the organization. That's the power of the organization. And as EAPs, we can help facilitate that. We can help put you in a position to facilitate that, right? Study resilience, just as a kind of an interesting background. When PTSD was entered into the DSM-3, funding becomes available. And they start testing folks if they meet the criteria for PTSD, and there's funding available to measure the outcome of treatment for PTSD. What they were finding back in the 80s was that most people after an adversity weren't meeting the criteria for PTSD, a small percentage. And so the question became, what about all these people, 90-something% of people who are getting through these adversities, not meeting the criteria of PTSD? Let's study them. So lots of studies started emerging on survivor populations. And as you see, this is what started coming up. This is what we started to learn, that people who were getting through these adversities had a level of efficacy, a confidence in themselves, that they were determined to get through it. They stayed connected, they stayed engaged through the adversity, rather than disengaging and dropping out. So there are a number of real important pieces here that we've learned. Self-disclosure of trauma with significant others, just mentioned that, how valuable that is. When you look down at the bottom, connection, bonding, social interaction with significant community and friends. These are the things that we want to start adding, making sure folks, our employees, are engaged in, because this is what works. And this is my favorite, the perception of personal and social resources to aid in coping in the post-trauma recovery environment. The perception, not necessarily accessing, right? We bring in all kinds of resources, and sometimes we hear that nobody went. Nobody accessed them. Does that mean it failed? Does that mean that people aren't going to get better? No, not at all. The organization created an environment, created a place where there was support and a blanket for the opportunity. That's a very powerful message organizations send to their employees. We care about you. And whether they access the services or not, that message is meaningful. Now, hopefully they do if they really need to, but we need to understand that it's really about employees' perception that their organization cares about them. So it is important to invite the EAP or invite whatever resources out. We want to understand how we can position leadership to demonstrate acts of care and support. When there's a critical incident, are you locking yourself up in the office? Or are you out and about walking around, touching base with people? Are you being role models? Are you being optimistic, encouraging, hopeful? If you have a good relationship with your employees, they're looking for them. That helps. One of the things that happens with employees after a critical incident, they're vulnerable. They're feeling vulnerable. And they're looking for guidance, they're looking for structure, they're looking for safety. And that can first come from the first steps the organization takes, how they address steps, the next steps. Are they putting out a communication? Are they being visible? Are they being upfront? When you do that, employees start feeling safer. And safety is the key. We have to get people to a state of safety before they can start bouncing back and have a resilient outcome. So safety is the key piece in our efforts when we're first responding. As we were mentioned earlier, resilience is often a term that gets thrown around. You know, I'm not really sure what it means all the time when people are saying it. It sounds like maybe it's self-esteem or maybe it's some kind of recovery thing. But there's a process to resilience, okay? You have to have a resilient outcome. There are three parts to this. You have to be able to talk about the incident at some point in time. And you're gonna want to talk to people that you trust. You want to talk to people, you're gonna want to talk to people who are compassionate. These things you know, right? That helps people start the resilience process, okay? So talking about it, okay? And it doesn't have to be with a counselor, or it can be. Usually it's going to be with a significant other. That's what starts helping people. There's also a rebound direction. You know, we talk about resilience as the process of bouncing back. What are we bouncing back to? We need a direction. When I worked in Connecticut for the Newtown shooting, we were working in different companies that were local to the community. There were lots of families that were impacted. And so as an EAP response, people were coming not to talk about the incident, they didn't want to talk about it. All they wanted was material to be the best parent they can be because they didn't know what to say to their kids about this. So their rebound direction was help me be the best parent. That's all they wanted. So we would give them information about parenting tips and different ages and that sort of thing. That's part of being resilient. Now they still, at some point, hopefully talk about it, because that's also part of it, right? Sometimes, if you think about some of the workers you may have, and if you have a first responder like worker, let's say a policeman just for an example, we know that policemen bounce back quickly, meaning that they can be involved in lots of different incidents and they're back out again. They're back out on the next call. And it seems like they're being resilient. We would define that as, boy, what a resilient person. Because they have a rebound direction. But it doesn't mean they talked about it. Many don't. And that also then leads to perhaps some poor choices in coping with the stress and angst from it. You know, you can have, maybe they drink more now. Maybe they eat more carbs. Doing things that aren't helpful for active coping. We want people to make good choices for how they cope through this. So it's these three areas that folks need to engage in to have a resilient outcome. Talk about it. Maybe they'll want to talk about it with you if you have a good relationship with it. That's great. Maybe they don't have a significant other or level of closeness. And talking about it with you works. This may be a little bit hard to see, but this is, SAMHSA had put out a worksheet here defining individual resilience and organizational resilience. And in the first two boxes are the attributes that I showed you earlier, the personal attributes, right? The optimism. These are this is what helps individuals bounce back. These are the things we're looking for. We want people to reconnect, and that'll help them move forward. Good. And what you see down here on the bottom for organizational resilience, I've showed you those two. Those are the attributes I showed you in the earlier slide. But there also are vulnerability factors. What gets in the way of somebody bouncing back? If folks are going through some of their own personal hardship at the time of an adversity, it's going to be harder for them to bounce back. If you're going through a separation or a divorce, and now something on top of that has happened, your ability to bounce back is going to be challenged. That's important information and that's where the EAP can be helpful in really bringing on additional support and resources, to help with not only the impact, but what else has been going on. And that's one of the roles of EAP. Not only are we going out there and looking for people who are dramatically impacted, but we also want to find out folks who are going through other adversities at the time of the incident, because they're going to have a harder time. And we also know that organizationally, if you work in an organization that doesn't pay much attention to the environment, then we also know that folks are going to have a harder time bouncing back within that environment. All right, so if it's a hostile environment, backstabbing environment, you don't trust leadership, that's not a good situation for resilience. So if that sounds like organizations, maybe there's some work you can do. Certainly there are things you can consult with the EAP, in terms of what options may exist or what training programs may exist for that. And one of the things that I like to know, sometimes I'll go out on site and the manager tells me, there are a group of employees that are really upset with us. We've been trying to do, we've been trying to be helpful, been trying to get them resources, but they are just upset with us no matter what we say, and you're going to meet them because they're pretty angry. So I know right off the bat, because I've been communicated that, I know that these folks are not going to get sources of resilience within their organization. It's not there, okay? Not at this point in time. So that's going to help me direct them in a different way. And it also is information for you as an organization of a gap. You'll notice here, facilitators of resilience. These are all the significant others who have been identified as potential positive resources. And if you'll notice, EAP is not in there, all right? So, I want you to know that, not that we can't be helpful, it's how we help that is really different. We want folks to be meeting with these folks. We want to help facilitate those connections, and the EAP will do that. And if there are difficulties along the way or if there are other challenges, we can help address that too. But when you look at this bottom, EAP is a facilitator of resilience for the organizational client. Your relationship with your EAP matters. Okay? How you connect, how you share, how you include the EAP at the seat at your table is going to matter. EAPs have been going through a lot of different trainings and approaches. The multi-systemic resiliency approach, quickly, I'll just briefly give you an overview. When there's an incident, there's a ripple effect. The incident hits the workplace. It ripples down to the employees. That ripples out to employees' family members. That ripples out to the community. It has this rippling effect because all of these systems are connected, right? And the same thing applies that when we bounce back, we need to reconnect all of these systems that have been working well together. And in terms of response work, in terms of EAP response work, there are 4 systems we want to pay attention to, right? There's the organization, there's the employees of the organization, there's the EAP, and the professional who goes on site. All of these systems need to work together. When you look at the organization, The organization isn't sitting around waiting for the EAP to come to start the resilience process. The organization is already doing things. You should already be doing things. You may have contingency plans. Maybe you thought about this kind of incident. You prepared for it, you drilled for it. So that goes in response. You have first responders on the scene. Leadership is calling, getting together, right? Communications are now starting to be drafted to send messages out to employees. Maybe there's communications out to family members and the media, right? There's employees are starting to outreach. There's lots of things organizations organically start doing or have some kind of formal program. Maybe you have a peer crisis early intervention team. All of that starts. So you guys started, right? And that's the way it should be, because you know your culture, right? And you are in the best position to respond to that culture, right? And as the partnership with EAP and FOH increases over the years, you become aware of that partnership or that cultural aspect as well. Employees aren't sitting around waiting for the EAP to come after an incident. They're already out starting to do things. They're supporting one another, and they're accessing different resources that may be put together. They're reading different communications that are going out. They're contacting folks at home, maybe they've gone home. So they're doing things too. They're already starting this process. And the relationship between the organization and the employees matter, as I mentioned earlier. If it's strong, if employees like their job, like their place of business, like their leadership, they give to the organization because the organization gives back. And that synergy is very powerful. And if it's weak, then there is no synergy. There's less synergy, and people have a harder time bouncing back. The EAP is a system, right? The EAP is a 24/7 operation. It's got training, it's got affiliates, it's got on-site folks. They are your partner. They're aware of the importance of cultural sensitivity. They can get access to treatment providers. So when we bring the EAP in, we're bringing in a resource that has some special skills that we want to add or complement what they're already doing. And the professional that goes out on site, the person that goes to the organization. Here's a person, again, they have training, they may have a private practice, they may be a full-time member of FOH, or maybe they're an affiliate. They need to understand the dual client process, that they're there to help the organization and employees. They need to understand what the EAP is all about, right? So here's another system, all of these folks coming together. And the better that the synergy amongst these systems, the more optimal outcome. The relationship between the professional who comes out with their EAP matters too. Psychological first aid, you may have heard of that. That is also an approach used by EAPs, primarily in the early stages. So if we're coming out to help soon after, when most folks are still in a state of disorientation or stunned by what's happened, the only thing we can really do is help them be safe, help them get to safety. And that's a psychological first aid approach, right? And these are some of the goals of psychological first aid. So EAPs also are trained in psychological first aid and are trained in when to use it. The role of crisis intervention, what you need to know, is to restore safety. Nothing happens until people are safe, right? So that's the first priority. We want to secure the environment, right? If medical treatment is needed, have that available, engage whatever contingency plans, visible leadership, getting communications out, different kinds of support in using psychological first aid. And you'll notice that all of these bullets here under restore safety are really organizational functions. These are your functions because you're there. You're the first ones there. And you certainly can be part of this process. And then once people are safe, we can engage that process of resilience, that process of bouncing back, where people can now feel safe that they can start talking about it or getting information about what they're bouncing back to and starting to use coping skills. Right, so the first part is safety, and the second part is resilience. Okay? But we're two different systems, right? And we have different needs to get to that end goal. And we hope that when you contact the EAP, you're able to commit the time for this process. Now, I would also say, for me, when I go out, I like to have as much information as possible. You know, rule out as many variables or understand it as much as possible. And I think that gives me the best opportunity to be successful. And I think that most counselors and most EAPs feel that way too. We also understand that sometimes things are hurried. But let me tell you something. The more people we can get on the phone, the better quality of an assessment we can do. That helps leadership be in a better position to feel confident in their next. It's called emotional regulating, all right? And what that means is that we want folks to be in control of their emotions after a critical incident. So if you're impacted and your leadership, we want you to be able to conduct yourself in a manner that has a level of confidence. We know you may be affected, but it's not going to be helpful if you're showing that impact all over your sleeves. Being on the call, talking about the incident with the EAP during this management consultation will help reduce that, will help empower leadership to feel more confident. So I encourage as many principals as possible to be on that call. Maybe it's going to be the first time they're talking about what happened. They need to do that to be effective leaders later on. Some of the best practices, EAP activation of resources begins immediately. Deployment is to be determined. So like I said before, you call in, we're activating people. Calls are going out, looking for people to be available, to free up their time. When they go out, that's going to be determined. That's going to be, get more assessment done when it's going to be the best. All leadership involved with an incident should be communicated with. Let's get everybody. It doesn't help if I'm talking, you call the EAP and you give some of the information, and then when EAP arrives on site, we meet with somebody completely different who may have a completely different perspective. So we want to try to tighten that up. I mean, that really creates, the more we're able to tighten that up, the better the synergy between the organization, the EAP. We want leadership involved who are close to the incident, proximity. Right? Departmental heads that their department may have been influenced, certainly HR. And as I mentioned, it improves leadership resilience by talking about their experience, being able to manage their feelings and reaction, receive some validations for what they're going through as leaders. And we perfectly know that this is not something that most of you get training in. You're winging it. You're doing the best you can. And we want you to know we are there behind you and can point you in a very effective use of. So one of the things that I certainly come into when I'm meeting with leadership on site is they'll ask, what is it that I can do? What is it that I can do to be helpful? And I have answers, and I want you to kind of consider all of these increase resilience, all right? And all of these position you in a very positive light. Certainly, we want you to be seen. You need to be out and about. Okay, it shows that you care. It helps employees feel safer. If you have the kind of workplace where people congregate, visit them. How's everybody doing? Let me update you on what's been occurring, the last 24 hours. Sometimes we don't necessarily want leadership to go bust up huddles or get these kinds of gatherings because they may be seeking collegial support. But we also want to be mindful that misinformation can also be spread. So encourage the getting together, but make sure they have the right information. Leadership should roll up their sleeves. Whatever the incident is, in the days afterwards, it's a different day. It is not a typical day. Participate. Show a side of yourself that is different. That goes a long way. If there's opportunity for volunteers, create projects for volunteers. People like to help in a crisis. And helping altruism is a source for resilience. So if you're able to create these projects, I would encourage you to do that. Feed them. This is the easiest one of them all. Make their day a little lighter. We're going to order pizzas today. We're just going to lighten your load. This is an unusual day, and we want you to have some food on us. Very simple. EAP introductions, one of the things that can also be very helpful is that when the EAP comes on site, walk the EAP around. Introduce the EAP to people you may have concern over, or everybody. You'll find that it gives the EAP the opportunity to speak about the program, about confidentiality if there's a concern about that. It puts a face on the counselor, and people are more likely to access when you have that kind of introduction. We want leadership to be good listeners and offer validation. That's really the key. People may be coming to you to share what they just went through. They just need somebody to listen. It's the head nod. It works. Repeat to them what it is that they're expressing. Reflective listening. Oh, I hear that you were very frightened. I certainly understand that, and I want you to know you're safe now. Okay, these are the little kinds of things that demonstrate empathy, demonstrate compassion, and fosters connection. Keep the information flowing. Information changes. Information comes from different sources, especially down here, right? You want to be in control of the information, or your organization does, because that's where people are working. Be optimistic. There's going to be an end to this. We're going to get through this. Okay, there's going to be some challenges, but we're here together, we're going to get through. Sometimes you may have a relationship where you can call people at home, just want to see if you're doing okay. That might be a wonderful gesture. Some people may not want you calling them at home, or there may be a policy against that. But you have to determine that. That's your call on that. But it can be very positive as a source of resilience. So some of the takeaways from today: identify personal attributes, know what yours are, and talk with your colleagues. What about theirs? Have a discussion about what you're learning here. Use employee surveys to identify the gaps in the organizational resilience. You've got so much information through those. And if you just look at it a little differently, the importance of filling those gaps contributes to resilience. Identify resilience champions. This is something that's happening in organizations. There are resilience coaches as employees in some organizations. That's all they do, is they work on employee resilience. But maybe there's somebody in your organization, that can be that identified person. Do training, do drilling, all of those things, all of that practice leads to emotional regulation, okay? It helps people with their emotional reactions and be able to focus on the tasks at hand when you practice them. Take a deep breath. You're going to have a stress reaction too. You'll probably be having that first one, the one that you have when you're driving a car, right? So take a deep breath. That will help shut off your stress response by deep breathing, diaphragmatic breathing from the belly. Have all leadership at the table. When you're going to be, and that may be, a lawyer at the table too. When you have an incident, you should be having as many voices as possible, including the EAP, to discuss what's going to be your plan. Now, not all incidents require, a roll call of 8 professionals sitting around the table, but some do. Some are pretty, you all know, what happens out in the news. The most powerful source of resilience is the connection with significant others. Don't forget about that. You have so much power and influence Getting people to be with their loved ones helps people feel safe. It starts their recovery. So include that in the plan if possible. Sometimes family members come to work sites or come to locations outside of work locations to meet with family members. There's all different kinds of creative things that we can get this to happen. Not everybody has significant others, so just don't assume that, we're sending somebody home. There may not be anybody home. So always keep that in mind too. Supervisor soft skills, I was just talking with somebody about this, and there are trainings, and maybe you have a training at FOH, that works on supervisors' soft skills, compassionate approaches with employees, listening skills, right? This is what works in terms of resilience versus the stodgy, indifferent, and even hostile manager. So if there's opportunity to train in soft skills, certainly do that. There may be ways of holding leadership accountable for their behavior towards their employees. Okay, got some ideas on that. But if we can create those kinds of connections in your organization, the research says this is where this resilience comes from. So consider that for something you might want to do too. And then save a seat at the table for your EAP. Any questions or more questions? I will turn it back over.
I can't believe there were no questions, but we're going to have lots of time for that before we wrap up this morning. So Robert talked about several key elements that I wanted to circle back to. And I wanted to focus on the FOH crisis response. And I can't recall if you had asked this earlier, but how many people have called us for a grief response, a crisis response? A lot, most people in the room. Okay. So I just wanted to walk through how our system is set up. The slide has the information, and if you've done it yourself, you've been through this experience. You call our 800 number that's staffed 24/7, the famous 800-222-0364, which if you don't have that on speed dial, you should probably have that on speed dial on your government-issued BlackBerry. And that'll get you to a live answer person who is going to start the assessment process. And get the details, and it'll be handed then over to a clinician then who will go into a further assessment and ask the things that Robert had listed on his earlier slides. Get the details of exactly what's happening now. Is it a security issue? Do you need to call 911? Are the police there? Is it an active crime scene? I don't want to get graphic, but more that needs to be cleaned before people come in. I mean, it's a very detailed, thorough assessment that we try to get as much information for so that we know how to best craft the response. And every situation is unique and every situation is different. And so maybe, unfortunately, you've had to call on a few occasions close in proximity to each other in time, and the assessment for one and the response to one might be completely different than the response to the other, because what drives how we respond are the answers to the questions that you provide. What we try to do is get information for the leadership that's closest to the affected population. Robert had a slide about the ripple and the pond effect, about an incident that occurs in the workplace. And I remember this being when 100 years ago when I was back in school, when you drop the pebble in the pond, there's the primary impact, the people who might have witnessed or been directly involved with the incident. Then the secondary people who might have been close by but didn't visually hear, see, smell, touch things. And then there's a third level of impact of people who were not directly related, but it trickles down, and it goes out like that. So in order for us to be able to help the most intense people who were intensely involved, it's important to get in touch with leadership and talk with them that are closest to the environment. So one of the challenges that we faced have been where people just call up and almost like place an order for, we had something happen, we'd like 5 counselors on site in 3 hours. And without having any more information than that, sometimes we've come up against needing to slow things down and ask more questions of people more directly involved so that we can create an appropriate response. You didn't mention this, and I wonder if you might be able to speak to this a little bit, is there are clinical reasons why we don't just fly out the door and show up on site. The research has shown, and best practices are, that there needs to be some time for the dust to settle. I don't know if any of you remember studying Maslow's hierarchy of needs back in the day, but it's that pyramid triangle, and at the bottom is food, shelter, water, and Band-Aids, bandages, that kind of thing. If that's not happening, if you don't have that, people are not going to talk to you about what's happening with them. They need to be safe, impacted by events, before they can even begin to talk about the impact that this is having. So in your statements of work, I believe it's written in there that the FOH critical incident responder, we'd say up to 48 hours before we would deploy on site for most situations. And again, that's part of the assessment process that occurs, and there's a clinical reason for that, because if we go in prior to when people are ready and in a psychologically safe place to start addressing these issues, we could be doing some damage. And reactivating and people just recognizing that people just aren't ready to go where we're trying to take them. The other piece too is I don't like saying this, but it's the truth is that we are not first responders. We're not paramedics. We're not EMTs, and we're not 911. So if a situation is of that nature, those are the appropriate resources to call, and first to secure the situation, and then EAP can come in and address whatever the fallout is beyond. A challenge sometimes has been that we can't go on site during an active crime scene. So if the tape is still up, our clinical people can't necessarily go under the tape when the police activity is going on in a crime scene. However, Robert said, this assessment starts with the first call. So we can be talking to leadership and management about, how is the organization responding? What are we going to do to be able to support your people before we get EAP on the scene? Because we'll be working it from that end as opposed to just the on-site response. So you call, we get the assessment, and then our team develops the response, and it can be anything from, maybe you can share what your experiences are. It can be anything from, several counselors on site for several days based on the nature of the situation, to talking with the manager and providing them with some handouts because the manager says, I think my team is good. I don't need somebody on site, but I want to give them something. So being able to get them some handouts that they can print out and to have something tangible and concrete in their hand they can take home and say, oh yeah, maybe I should go for a walk after work tonight, and start working on the resilience factors that can help them recover. So
one other question. I haven't heard any mention of the use of social media.
I would offer that question out to the other agencies in the room, because my thought is that agency by agency is going to have different guidance on how they use social media. I know with the ATO crackdowns, and every day it gets more intense for what you're allowed to do and what not to do. I'm not sure how that might impact an agency's ability to communicate. I know in private industry, that's built into some plans for how to get, and even like in a college campus, everybody gets the text of shelter in place, active shooter in the library quad, or whatever it might be. So there are programs out there that do use social media. Again, talk with your account executive or ask, does anybody else in the room have an example where they use or share that, Ken?
Back in the times of September 11th and events, there was a period of time when the agencies I worked for enjoyed very much that Nextel push-to-talk thing, because that's kind of gone away. But our agency now has a new app called Wave Communications, a secured app, and it uses cell towers. Same concept as social media, because it's using Wi-Fi and the cell towers, but it's secure and closed.
What it's called again?
The Wave Communications app.
Okay.
And we're finding that to be a very effective way to get instant communication without relying on landlines and
An age of running things past legal, do you find do we need to have our legal people involved when if there is something we're talking about, some big something go on or whatever, but they're always a hindrance to me, but I have to go through them or whatever, so I just wondered, what is your experience or FOH's experience with?
Well, I don't know if because this is a legal question, I don't think I'm going to answer this one. I will pass this one on.
Yeah, and I'll tell you administratively, we deal with, certainly legal is a consideration, and it's something where we would encourage you, depending on your agency and the politics that are involved there, to go ahead and get your legal involved, as well as your PR group, anybody that's handling messaging or your communications branch. But certainly there are a lot of players to take into consideration when you're activating on that level. So certainly take your legal into consideration at least.
They have a perspective too, and it's one that is valuable. I mean, there's, for instance, especially with a RIF or a layoff, a lawyer may view that as bringing in resources adds liability or potential liability. So they may have that view. That doesn't necessarily mean the interventions get interrupted, but they have a view that should be considered.
Experience, which has really been more on the clinical assessment side, is that's part of the assessment that we get done, is to ask, what has the organization what has leadership done? Have they, has this gone up to senior level leadership? Is there a communication strategy? Have you talked with your legal department? So I don't think, if I interpreted your question correctly, I've not had any experiences. Maybe Elizabeth and others in the room can about their experience with this. But we haven't been presented with legal challenges for EAP to come on site to do a response. But more in the assessment part, for the organization has legal been consulted as the organization figures out how they're going to? Elizabeth, would you add anything to that? I don't mean to put you on the spot.
No, I wouldn't. The only thing, Robert mentioned reduction in force situation. Do you have their interest? That also needs to.
I was just going to say, sometimes it's just the opposite. They may encourage the support because they want to reduce the long-term legal implications of them not intervening. So you may actually find an ally in that case. Or the other thing I find that they've done in various organizations is they may say, this is how you need to word this or convey this to them. In other words, one of the things we talked about was mandating that people participate in counseling. They would say, you can't do that. You can offer it. And in which case you just are being encouraged to word the offer in such a way that it's seen as voluntary. So I don't see them necessarily as antagonists in that situation.